Hey guys, what's up? This is Nachos, and in this video I'm going to show you guys 5 data exploits that will help you crush the low stakes games that you're playing. So, number 1, be versatile pre-flop. And this is something that especially, like, let's say more experienced recreationals or decent low stakes players, some might even be professional already, are doing wrong. A lot of players are too static with their ranges, like everyone sort of knows to some extent what they should be opening, three betting from most positions, but people are not well versed at adapting to the situations that are at hand. First off, we're going to go over some data real quick here, sort of would help you make decisions in game, and then I'm going to show you an example of how versatile pre-flop actually is. So let's start off with the pool's not three betting enough at low stakes, and especially in wider formations where you need to three bet a relatively wide range, that can be a problem. So you can see here blind v blind, so small blind opens, and how often is the big blind three betting? The solver is at roughly 18%. Now it will change a little bit on like the rig structure and the model that you're using, but give or take 18%. The pool's at 14%. This might not seem very significant, it's just a slight under raise, but it will have a significant impact on your strategy, right? Like the top of your folding range and the bottom of your calling opening range from the small blinds, those are like the line is drawn exactly there simply because of the fact that you get three bet sometimes. And if you have the bottom of your opening range and you get three bet, then you just have to fold. If you don't get three bet as often, then suddenly a lot more hands are becoming profitable. So opening range, that normal opening range might be like 45. If your opponent is in fact three betting 14%, you might be opening 55, 60% of your range, even more. The same thing goes for four betting enough out of position. And again, I put some data in here from a blind v blind scenario. So let's say we are now on the big blind. Our opponent opens the small blind. So everyone falls to the small blind. The small blind opens. We are on the big blind. And we are thinking about three betting. But we have a hand that always has to fold versus a four bet. And therefore, we are not too thrilled about three betting it. Say something like King Jack offsuit, which is generally a call in that formation. If your opponent is not 4-betting you enough, then obviously you don't have to pay the tax of getting 4-bet as often, and the EV of 3-betting goes up. So if you have King Jack offsuit in that scenario, exploitatively it might be a very good strategy to go ahead and 3-bet it because your opponent is not 4-betting you often enough. Now, obviously, individual players in every pool are going to be capable of 4-betting enough, 3-betting enough, and so it's always important to look at your opponents and be versatile, be actually versatile, not just play versus a pool, but play on a table in a very specific environment and make specific decisions every time that you open three bets, etc. But on average, the pool is not nearly three betting and four betting enough. And so when someone opens the small blind, like if you put this in the solver, then the big blind would just play three bet or fold and would just three bet all of the continues. Why? Because two things can happen mostly. One is the small blind folds, which means you win the pot, great outcome. And the other is the small blind calls and you get to realize equity, which is also great. And obviously sometimes, like 13% of the times, you get four bet and you have to fold. But because you don't have to pay the tax 1 in 5 times, but maybe 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 times, you are now better off just three betting heaps. Now I'm not saying you should play three bet or fold, but keeping this into consideration and looking at your opponent's stats and thinking about what kind of player type he is he going to be one of those guys that is not four betting enough, will generate a lot of EV and a lot more EV than just playing static ranges. All right, so let me show you actually. Here we are with two ranges and I used Hold'em Resource Calculator for this. It's a very powerful tool and will work on most, even like my laptop on which I'm making the video today, which is a decent laptop, nothing too fancy, is able to just run this program. What I did here is I picked a button opening range. And so on the left side here, you can see a balanced, roughly GTO opening range. Now there might be, like if you compare it to some GTO wizard opening range, there might be some slight differences, but more or less this is what it should look like. You are opening like all suited broadways, all suited kings, all suited queens, but something like, let's say King 6 off will always be a fold. Ace deuce off will always be a fold. And yeah, like there's all sorts of things that are just going to be too weak to open. Why? Well, you're on the button, so both the small blind and the big blind can three bet you still. And collectively that will happen, let's say 25% of the times. And if you open, let's say, a hand like king 6, king 5, and you know that you're getting 3-bet 25% of the times, that means that you're investing, let's say, 2.5 big blinds, and 25% of the times you just give that away. And in order for your open to be profitable, that means that the other 75% of the times you need to make a significant amount of money. Now, you might have a skill edge over your opponents, and you might be able to win some there. But another way to start opening wider is if instead of 25% of the times that you get 3-bet, you get 3-bet a little bit less. This happens very often in Russian cash games where people play too many tables and just end up 3-betting not often enough. So what I did here is I had a regular balanced opening range and then node locked the small blind and the big blind to be under 3-betting slightly. Nothing too massive. 3-bet, I lowered the 3-bet of the small blind by 1% point, so 14.5 becomes something like 13.5, and the big blind I lowered by 2% points, and that reflects sort of what you'd expect in a regular low stakes game. In a Russian cash game, people end up 3-betting even less, so the difference would be larger here. And then I just put those restrictions in the solver, and the solver is like, well, okay, if I knew this, that I'm not getting 3-bet as often, and suddenly something like king 7 becomes a pure open, ace 3 becomes a pure open. You can see 10-6 is the widest open in a balanced range. Now 10-4 becomes a pure open. The balanced opening range is roughly 44%, and the exploitative opening range is 56%. So quite quickly, in another very extreme scenario, like we are not saying this is a table with like 2 nits in the big blind. If there's 2 nits, like 2 guys that are not calling and not raising enough, and it's pretty clear, which will happen quite often in like Russian cash games, or if you're playing on GG and you have one of those like 12 tablers on your table, the small blind and big blind, then very quickly you open 80, 90%. So this is like just a very normal scenario where you should just take a look at the small blind and the big blind, realize, hey, they might be one of the average racks, they're not over 3-betting me, and so I'm just going to exploitatively open a little bit wider. All right, exploit number 2 is attack checking ranges. I can't stress enough how important this is. You see here, this is one of my older graphs. I think this is up to 2020 or something like that, where I moved up from low stakes to 1K. And you can see my red line is just going almost vertical, and it is because I was extremely aggressive in all these pots where people didn't really care about. So anytime someone checked twice, I would just automatically bet and just be aggressive, keep barreling, and make sure that I force them into tough decisions. One thing that the pool notoriously does is they underprotect checking ranges, especially at low stakes and micro stakes. And what that means is that whenever your opponent has the option to c-bet, but he doesn't, then that tells you that he generally has too weak of a range, and you should attack that. You should be aggressive. So I will show you a hand. Here we go. All right, for the next data exploit, I'm going to show you guys a hand here where we are on the button. We open 3 times the big blind, which is a bit large, but this is an old hand that I played a couple years ago, and pre-flop doesn't really matter. The most interesting part happens here on the turn. So we choose to not c-bet our hand on this texture, which is fine. Our ace queen can go to showdown quite neatly, like we capture quite a lot of EV. If we check back here and our opponent checks again and we get to check back again, or if the board pairs and our opponent bets, we can call. Whereas if we have a hand like, let's say, queen 9, that becomes a lot harder. Also, we don't have any spades in our hands, so we don't benefit as much from building a pot and sometimes hitting a flush because we just can't. So checking back here, the flop is totally fine. And then we get a check, and now we have to make a decision. And I want you guys to think about what you would do in this situation, and I'm going to come back to you with some data. All right, so here we are with some data. So in that scenario where we have ace queen on 10-7 deuce check, we have the option to delay c-bet. And before we make a decision, it makes sense to just look at what is the pool doing on average in this scenario. And what I put on the screen in front of you here is data that suggests that the pool is overfolding. If we bet small, 1/3 of the pot, then Pyro is folding 35%, the pool is folding 48%, significant overfold. And on top of that, the pool is under raising versus delayed c-bets. So Pyro is raising 14% of the times, and the pool is raising 9% of the times. Both are heavily leaning. You should heavily lean towards delayed c-betting when both of these are happening. The under raise is very good for hands that don't really want to bet because you prefer to just go one street closer to showdown. If you bet and you get check raised, then you'd have to fold or sometimes have to fold. Like hands like ace-8, for instance, in that scenario that you just watched, are hands that you can see the solver here. This is pure checking. Getting check raised is very uncomfortable, and just checking back and getting one street close to the showdown will generate a lot of EV for you because you just have a hand that wins at showdown quite often. Now, if you're not getting check raised as often, and on top of that, you might get some folds by your opponent that you shouldn't really get, then things sort of change. So what I did here is first I ran like the equilibrium strategy, and this would be the equilibrium strategy on 10-7 deuce jack when you have the option to delay c-bet. And then what I did is I said, okay, well, let's assume that this data is true, but not to the same extent that it's true. So what I did is I increased the folding frequency from 35 to 37. So just a slight increase, just a minimal increase. And I lowered the check raising frequency from 14 to 12. In reality, it's a much larger overfold and a much larger under raise. But I just wanted to see, like, if I just give it a nudge in the direction that we think, according to the data, we should be heading into, what would happen to this very balanced approach? And you can see 99.9% of the time should be betting small. Only ace-3 offsuit has like a sliver of checks in there. But if you let it run a little bit longer, I'm sure that even like ace-3 suited is just betting pure. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells you that if you're in doubt, which apparently we were with ace-queen, it's probably an okay strategy to just be betting. I'm not saying you should always bet range and just blindly bet range like I did like previously when I played this strategy, because this strategy was played in 2018, 2019, and people are a little bit better at like understanding how other players play and adjusting to that. What I am saying, however, is that you should be aware of this data and you should probably increase your overall betting frequency on the turn quite significantly. Exploit number 3 is going to be a fun one, especially if you're not a nit, because you should probably be bluffing more, especially at low stakes where people are sort of in that area where they have learned that they can't just call everywhere and are now possibly overfolding a little bit. You should try to put your opponent in tough decisions. A lot of players are under bluffing to begin with in these games, so just bluffing more and more aggressively is generally not a bad strategy. Even if you're just not doing it exploitatively, you sometimes just need to bluff more simply to become more balanced. But exploitatively, it's a very good strategy as well. So one of the rules that I give my players when they're playing low stakes is when in doubt, bluff. And this means that if you have a hand that is not necessarily blocking any of your opponent's folds, so let's say you have a flush draw, and you miss the flush draw, then generally that's not a great bluff, because if you have the flush draw and you're bluffing, that means that your opponent can't fold as many flush draws because you are blocking some of those flush draws. But if that's not really happening, if you expect your bluff to be at least indifferent, meaning it will be mixing in sometimes, then generally just bluffing is a reasonable approach. And then you gotta sometimes adjust if you realize, hey, people are adjusting to me, the pool is adjusting to me. But generally speaking, you should just bluff. And why is that? Well, let me show you this chart here. So this chart is for when your opponent is in the big blind, you are in position. So button, cutoff, middle position, early position, and it's a single raised pot. You are the pre-flop aggressor. So you raised pre-flop, everyone folded, the big blind called, you are in position. And you can see that there's a bunch of different lines in here. We'll go with the first one that says check call, check call, check fold. And this is how often is your opponent supposed to check all the flop, check all the turn, and then check fold the river. So in other words, we are triple barreling, and how often is our opponent folding? And you can see if we go 75% on the river, so we bet the flop, bet the turn, and then we bet the river for 75% of the pot, the solver would be folding 45% of the times, and the pool is folding 2% points more. Now, if you go through the entire chart, all of the lines that are in this chart, you can see it is either slightly overfolded in the triple barrel line, but in all the other lines, overfolds are quite massively. And that kind of shows you why you should be willing to bluff more. The pool generally struggles to defend. So when in doubt, pull the trigger and just try to get your opponent out of the pot. All right, so exploit number 4 is trust your opponent's bet size. And this is one that I think is relatively intuitive if you think about it. Just ask yourself, like, you have a set, you're on the turn, you have the option to delay c-bet. What are you likely doing? And quite likely what you're doing is you're going and just betting slightly bigger than you would otherwise would, which is a very human thing to do. And generally, it's like not even a bad strategy to do so. If your opponent is playing relatively passive, then you should bet stronger hands for bigger sizes and weaker hands for smaller sizes because you're not getting punished for it. So this is something that if you're the aggressor, you should probably do in most low stakes environments where you're not getting check raised often enough, not getting raised often enough. So just be more honest with your bet sizes is generally a reasonable strategy. But once you are defending, once you're facing bet sizes, you should be aware that other people are doing this as well. You can see this in this chart. This is whenever you face a c-bet. So you're on the big blind, your opponent is, let's say, on the button. He's sitting in position. It's a single raised pot, and he is c-betting the flop. If you face a quarter pot c-bet, what a lot of players will often do is they will like look at a solver like GTO Wizard, Pyro Solver, and they will try to study these ranges that the solvers are giving them. And that's a reasonable strategy. I'm not saying don't do that. Definitely do that. But also take into consideration the fact that on some boards, people might, like the c-betting strategy might not be very clear. Sometimes they might go for a range bet. But then when they have middle sets, they're like, well, I could also size up on this texture. So I'm just going to size up this time because I have middle set. And this is not like a very conscious process oftentimes. Usually this is a subconscious process and people are like just a little bit greedy whenever they have middle set. And so what you can see here is if your opponent bets small and then faces a check raise, on average they're overfolding slightly. If your opponent faces, c-bets larger, so let's say 75% of the pot, and then faces a check raise, now suddenly they're over defending. And this kind of shows you that if they bet larger, they have a stronger range than they should, and therefore they aren't folding as often as they technically should. What does this mean for your strategy? Well, it means that if you are facing a c-bet that is larger, for instance, you're not really incentivized to bluff raise as often because you're just facing a stronger range. But also, and this is especially true in non-c-betting nodes, like whenever you face a probe or delayed c-bet, because those are generally nodes where sizings aren't really standardized yet for a lot of players. So like on the flop, when you face a c-bet, king 8 deuce, and you face like a small c-bet, you can just sort of assume that he's range betting. On the turn, however, you can often mix multiple sizes and you got to mix betting and checking pretty much on all textures. So what ends up happening is people end up betting small whenever they have like a weakest range, weakest hand that wants to either get a cheap fold or that wants to get some cheap protection. And then they are betting bigger whenever they have like middle sets. And so whenever you face those larger bet sizes, you should tread carefully. You should expect them to keep barreling the river more often, for instance. You should expect them to underfold, over defend versus raises. And whenever they are betting smaller, you should be attacking those smaller bets by raising thinly for value, raising aggressively with bluffs, and put them into a lot of tough decisions. Now, like I said, this is true pretty much throughout the game tree. This is just like the chart that you're seeing here. It's just a c-betting facing check raise chart, but it happens throughout the game tree. So face a small bet, be aggressive, face a large bet, and tread with caution. All right, for the next data exploit, I'm going to show you guys a hand where we face some aggression from a recreational. So we open a small blind recreational calls. We c-bet 1/3 on this texture, which would be fine. You can just range bet this if you want to. You can play an exploitive strategy and mix. You can all do all sorts of things, but for all intents and purposes, range betting is fine. And then check, we face a bet. We call because we have a 5-out pair and our opponent bets half pot. So we are going to be good often enough and we can still improve. And then here we check again and we face another half pot bet. And a lot of poker players, even some advanced poker players, will say things like recreationals on the bluff, don't overcall versus them. But I'm going to hopefully change your mind. So let me show you some data. All right, so here we are with the data. You can see the chart. I'll dive into it in a sec. But first I want to tell you a quick story. Not too long ago, I was doing a masterclass for Run It Once where there were 5 speakers and the masterclass was on exploiting recreationals. And the first question that I asked in the masterclass was like a live audience type thing via Zoom was how would you exploit recreationals in the games that you're playing currently? And one of the most common answers was overfold versus their bluffs, or like they're under bluffing, so we should be overfolding. As you can guess by now, I ended up calling the hand. I'll show you the result in a second, but this is just plain wrong. Recreationals generally pretty much every scenario are over bluffing. And especially if you face a half-pot bet, you have a bluff catcher that wins, that beats their bluffs, or most of the bluffs, you generally just end up calling. How can it then be that people still end up overfolding versus recreationals? And I think one of the things to consider is that poker is a pot odds game. This means that if you face that half pot bet like we just did with our ace-3, then you are okay. Like you only need to be right 26% of the times for it to be profitable. And so if you call and you lose 74% of the times, you are losing the majority of the times, the overwhelming majority of the times, yet it's still a profitable call. And this is something that's really hard for the human brain to accept. Like whenever you are, let's say you're calling 4 of these hands in a row and you expect them to win 26% of the times, then it's not that unheard of to just lose them all 4, right? You just need to win 1 and 4 on average, but if you run a little bit bad, you're losing all 4. And the thing that poker reinforces, like the thought that poker reinforces in that moment is you click call, so you make an action and you lose. And that happens 74% of the times. Now, obviously, in reality, it's never actually 74. Probably it's like a little bit more because people are actually over bluffing and stuff like that. But still, quite often you end up with a bluff catching scenario where the moment that your opponent bets, the money that is in the middle is sort of already lost. And let's say he bets half pot, then what you can do is you can invest half of the pot and get a little bit more than half of the pot back. If your opponent is betting 3 big blinds in 6 big blinds, the 6 big blinds you've already lost. Question is, can you invest 3 big blinds and maybe win 3.05 big blinds back? And on average, and that would mean it's profitable. But this is a very hard thing to grasp, and a lot of players are just not like aware of this, like not consciously aware of the fact that you should be losing the majority of the times. That's the point of playing a pot odds game. It's still a profitable call. All right, so now if we go through the hand, you can see there's like all sorts of lines in here that your opponent could be taking. This is one of the bluff catching grids that we have in Nachos CFP. This is not me just spending like a Sunday afternoon just calling these grids. This is all based on data. And we have a spreadsheet that calls all these grids based on the data on the data that we put in. The line that we were facing was call flop, because we see that the flop our opponent called, bet turn, bet river. And you can see even on underbluff textures, we are still calling up to 200% of the pot. So a wildly overbluffed spot, especially for half pot. It is like you're actually getting pretty close to winning 50% of the times, which if you face half pot is pretty insane. And so definitely a spot that you should be calling. And in general, whenever you're facing bets by recreationals, especially if you play a lot of hands and are like playing that loosey-goosey style, then you should just be willing to click call and lose the majority of the times, but still make profitable plays. All right, so before I'm going to show you the end result of this hand here, where we were facing that half pot on the turn and then half pot on the river, I want to ask you guys to like and subscribe. If you guys have any comments, feedback, whatever, just drop in the comments down below. There should be a link to a free Discord server, and it would be very cool if we could welcome you guys there. And then what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you the hand. And luckily, like, I was smart enough to pick a hand where we were obviously facing a bluff here. This doesn't prove anything. I just want to be very clear. I just wanted to show you guys the end result here. Keep in mind that people are, especially recreationals, are over bluffing massively. Now his hand should be bluffing. It's totally fine for him to bluff, but you're going to see all sorts of random stuff here. And so calling is mandatory. All right, so that's it for this video. If you guys have any questions, drop them down in the comments below, and talk to you guys soon. Bye.